Hey guys, welcome back to another YouTube video, and in this video we're going to be talking about 5 advanced pro tips that IGLs can use. This one's not going to be edited that much. I'm just going to be doing a verbal lesson, so you can just follow along. You just have to listen and watch the notes on screen that I'll be writing right here. Sorry about the dark camera, as usual. This will be fixed in due time, but let's talk about duos, right? There's not that much to really talk about in general prior to telling you the 5 tips, but I did want to point out one thing, right? I did want to point out this important detail, which is the fact that there's 2 main setups in duos, right? It's very simple. The first one is the IGL/Fragger setup. This is the most commonly heard, but not necessarily the most commonly executed. So I'll explain what I mean by that. But the second one is actually having a TARP lead and then an observer, so someone who calls out things that they see, information, or a follower, right? And they just copycat that. You can even write copycat here, right? And that's sort of how I think about it, at least. This is actually more common in duos, believe it or not, although there are setups with pro teams and other amateur teams where people have a hard IGL and the other guy is just doesn't make calls at all, right? Only one person makes a call. Now, I personally believe that this is a better setup, just because having 2 sets of eyes making calls and having both people know the game sense so that they can both make calls is a very important aspect of your duo. So if you are this sort of setup where your fragger's not making calls at all, I would at least, potentially let them make a couple calls, even if it's an 80-20 split or something that sort. Understand that they should be able to make calls too, as long as they're good calls, right? Of course, they should be capable of making good calls before they sort of transition into this setup, but that's okay. This just is letting you guys know that there's different setups here, right? Personally, really important aspect, this can flip between players, right? This setup right here. What I mean by that, let's say you have your player 1 and player 2 and you guys are moving forward like this, right? And then zone pulls back, but not exactly back into your TARP at an angle. Now this player, if you want to rush for it, right, you want to get ahead of zone and really make sure you're front TARP, this player will now become TARP lead, right? The roles switch, and then this person becomes observer follower. This person is more than capable of TARPing, because a good duo should be capable of doing everything. And then they move like this. I want your duo to have that flexibility where you can become this setup right here and highlighted. So let's just move on. I just wanted to give you guys a sort of brief on this sort of thing, because people don't really necessarily understand that this video could actually apply for both people in your duo. You understand? Because if you're doing this, the calls can come from both players, and it's very important to understand that you can actually use all of these tips for both players in your duo. And that's just something that I wanted to point out. So let's get into it, right? 5 advanced tips for IGLs. Pretty simple. First thing, very simple, but actually really important. It sounds not that advanced, but I really want you to understand the impact that this tip has on your gameplay. And it's as simple as make it as easy as possible for your teammate to follow. You understand, right? So when I say follow, I don't necessarily just mean physically, although that's an aspect of it, right? When I say physically, I mean TARPs, right? I mean the rotates that you do, make it as easy as possible for your teammate to follow. That is one aspect of it. That's actually the more obvious ones, right? But what about communication? The choice of words that you use can be difficult to follow. You understand? So a really clear example of this is, instead of just saying follow me, come follow me, you could tell them exactly what you're planning to do ahead of time, right? So that the communication is very much easier to follow, instead of just saying come here or go left, right? Go left is better than come here. You understand? And sometimes they don't even know where you are, so come here is very vague. And there's examples of this, right? This is just very simple examples, but there's more examples past this where you should particularly be careful with the words you choose, because they're not easy to follow when you listen to them. You understand? So it's very important to particularly actually VOD review your comms, record your games and VOD review your comms, because sometimes you could be making communications that is very, very difficult to follow, and the other player could be doing the same. And this is something that we need to smooth out and make sure that we're doing well. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to actually play the game as a team. And we know, obviously, that that's an important part of the duo, playing as a team. Next thing, if you're the hard IGL, let's say you have this sort of setup, right, and you're making 90% of the calls, you best believe you better understand the game, right? Actually understanding the game, right? And so in other words, you should be the one, right, putting the most amount of time in the game macro wise. What do I mean by that, right? Macro wise, I'll give you some examples so you'll understand through examples what I mean by that. Because in other words, if you have 90% of the say, or 95% of the say, or even 100% of the say in terms of calls, they better be good calls, right? You like your whole team's relying on this, right? And sometimes it's trios, sometimes it's duos, but in any case, right, your team's relying on this, so you better make the right call. In other words, macro. Like, what do I mean by macro? Surge positioning is macro, right? Circled 1 to 5 rotates is macro, right? Layering in endgame is macro. Very important macro, actually, because if you position yourself wrong in endgame, maybe you're too high and you get sprayed by hay. There's stuff like that as well. Wind conditions, right? Wind conditions in endgame. Sometimes it goes up a hill. Like, what's your wind condition there? Yeah, you got to get up, right? And actually understanding that, you know, positioning in the prior zone, because there's a potential for it to pull up a hill, is an also important detail that you should take into account. Another thing is off-spawn strategy, right? Just, you're most likely going to be discussing and telling your teammate what to do in this sort of setup. You're usually the smarter player, right? And that's why you should be very, very refined in all of these things. Otherwise, your team will fail in this case, okay? So it's very important to get this right, okay? Third tip, because in other words, what I'm really saying here in the second tip actually is put more time into VOD reviews than you usually do. Obviously, you should be good micro-wise as well. Your mechanics, aim, and sort of peaks, edits, all these things should be good, obviously. But it's important to understand that these details are actually what get you through heats and into grand finals, for example. This becomes more important in that sort of environment. So get this right, okay? Third tip, talk less in general, because a lot of pro teams actually do this, because sometimes you're saying stuff that could be clogging up comms or clogging up audio so that your teammate can't hear important edits or pickaxes that on your wall, or, you know, footsteps, for example. So only say what's important, right? And actually, if you talk too much, it sort of clouds the things that are important. In other words, sometimes if you're just constantly talking, the important detail becomes sort of saturated, right? It becomes sort of left in the details. And it's really important to only talk when you need to, and only talk about important details, okay? Another sort of way you can think about this is, you know how sometimes people scream? They talk about like urgency in your voice. If you're constantly enthusiastic about, you know, what's going on, and you're constantly screaming, you're constantly yelling, you're constantly like, come here, right? And it's very important to understand that that doesn't do you any good. Your duo's not benefiting from that, and it's important to only use that urgent voice comm or urgent style when it's actually important. Like in my box, for example, as a comm. If you use that in every scenario, I think that would not be good for you. Understand? So try to avoid sort of just putting urgency in every part of your game, right? So talk less and only put urgency in urgent situations, right? This is important. And then in other words, right, like the important situations, like for example, an enemy in your box, stand out in this way, right? If you constantly talk, come here, follow me, left, right, like it's gonna be difficult. It's gonna be very difficult for your teammate to actually follow you, which goes back to, you know, this tip right here. You have to get this right, okay? So tip number 4. Let's talk about tip number 4. Very important, actually. This one's difficult but important to understand. Pre-planning. I talk about pre-planning a lot, and it's for good reason. It's important, right? Tell your teammates what you're about to do before you do it. And some other scenarios is talk about potential plans that can happen if X happens. For example, I'll give you some examples, okay? Because this is actually pretty important. I want you guys to understand this. Examples is the best way to sort of explain this. So good example is, let's say you're waiting, you get into static zone. In other words, the end zone of a moving zone, the end zone, the white circle of a moving zone. You're waiting, right? You're waiting for the next moving to show. While you're waiting, because you have nothing else to do, there's no clear impact opportunities near you, and you're just waiting. You're waiting like full in a metal box. You're just waiting with your teammate. You tell your teammate, if it pulls double pull forward, we're going to take low ground. Okay, that's very clear. If it pulls west, we have to go up, right? And even that actually is not even that important, because if we have to go up, that's more on you. You understand? That one's more on you, because you're the tarper. If you're tarping, you don't need to tell your teammate you have to go up. You just do it, right? You could tell him, it could help, but actually the more important comm is the one for low ground. Because what you're essentially telling your teammate is like, if it pulls double pull forward, when I say double pull forward, all I mean is the moving zone pulls in the same direction as the previous moving zone. We're going to take low ground, right? And why is that a good play? Because dead side is the double pull forward direction, right? So if it double pulls forward, front side is dead side, which means there's a lot of empty space on low ground that you can just drop down and cut in front of previous low ground and place ramps and walls and then take low ground for yourself. You understand? This is why it's important, because it's a very timely action. If you don't do this right then and there, the opportunity is gone and you won't have low ground. Low ground's a win condition, right? Talked about win conditions earlier. It's a win condition to make sure that you get top 2 in your game, guaranteed, as long as you hold it properly. Pretty simple example, but actually really important. You know, this could also happen for height, right? Height opportunities. Like in half-half, you tell your teammate, like, we may go for height, just be ready for it, right? You're telling your teammate to be prepared for the call, so that when the call comes, they're not surprised, they know exactly what to do. Understand? So this could be a good opportunity as well for you to clean up your gameplay and make sure you're pre-planning, telling your teammate to be on the same page. Okay, last thing, very important. This is actually probably the most important tip that I could offer you guys, honestly, is to be decisive. Right? Really important. If you can't be decisive, it's going to be very difficult to do well in this meta, honestly. SMG spray makes things way more fast-paced than possible. It's often better, right? This is the detail that I really want you to understand, okay? Understand that making the 3rd or 4th best decision in any given situation with confidence here, right? In any given situation is often better than making the best possible play with self-doubt. Okay, now this is something that a lot of people don't understand. People think Fortnite is chess. People think that if you make the wrong move, you're dead. This is not necessarily true. Actually, it's more about how you execute certain plans, right, than it is about, you know, because you see people landing on height when it makes no sense to land on height. You see people doing stuff that you've never seen before, and these are pro teams too. It's just they're confident about the play, they execute on it, and they're very convinced that this is the right play. Right, so oftentimes it's better to make a decision in a lower amount of time, especially in endgame, than it is to wait, hesitate, get yourself killed, and then be like, oh, I know what to do now. Right? No point, not at all. And oftentimes staying ahead and staying, like, you know, front side is an important detail in duos, and it's important to understand that if you hesitate there, you could lose it. For example, on low ground, it's very important. Sometimes you tank storm for this, to stay ahead, to prevent other people from dropping down in front of you and taking low ground from themselves, right? If you hesitate on that, it's over. So it's very important to, like, constantly stay ahead, especially in a very stacked endgame. That becomes even more important, okay? So really get this point, because this is probably the most important tip in this video. Seriously, very important detail, okay? Because if you get this part right, I think you'll be a very good IGL, even if you ignore everything else, although I do recommend learn all of these, right? So let's review very simply. Make it as easy as possible for your teammates to follow, both physically and communicatively, the choice of words and your tarp and your rotates in general. Actually understand the game, right? Study the game, make it an art where you learn every little detail, and especially, actually, it's not about every, you know, small detail, because if you learn everything, some things don't matter as much as the others, right? So learn the stuff that matters. Watch pros, because that's the best way to do it. Talk less and only put urgency in urgent situations, and then this way the most important situations stand out this way. Because if you're constantly screaming and then you scream in my box, it doesn't stand out as much, it doesn't click. Make sense? So really make sure that it clicks, it stands out. Pre-planning, make sure you tell your teammates what you're about to do before you actually do it, so they're prepared, so they know what to do. And also, like, we're about to rotate is better than I'm rotating, come. Right? Because if you do I'm rotating, come, and you run full speed ahead, there's a bigger gap between you and your teammate now. Whereas if you're holding Yeti, you're just waiting, and you say, are you ready? We're about to leave. And then he's like, okay, yeah. And then, make sense? Instead of doing I'm leaving, and then he reacts, and then there's a big gap that way. So just make sure your teammate's always with you that way, right? This is what pre-planning does for you. So final tip, the most important one, is to be decisive and make sure you understand that it's not always about the best play. Even though you have to try your best to get to that point, it's often about doing the subpar play with confidence and making sure that you're confident when you're doing it. And your execution often matters more than the plan itself. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.